Well, you requested it, and we are about to deliver it. What is the it I'm referring to? Having a well-known best-selling author as a guest on today's show who specializes in retirement planning. So stay tuned to this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. Welcome to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton. Here, of course, my good friend and co-host, Sarah Samuels. And today, we are talking with a best-selling author about the things you need to know on retirement planning. So stay with us here for the next hour. There's a lot of good tidbits from this incredibly successful best-selling author.
That's right, Dave. And of course, it's great to be here with you and with all of our listeners. Now, what Dave forgot to mention here is that he is actually the best-selling author that we are going to be interviewing for the next hour.
Oops.
We have a lot of your questions that you've sent in about Dave's most recent book that's come out. You can purchase it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. But the book is Retirement Income Source, just like our radio show. And it is really the ultimate guide to everything you need to know about retirement income. So, Dave, thank you for joining us on your show to talk about your book. And, you know, this isn't your first.
Thank you for having me here.
Well, it's not your first best-selling book either.
No, it's not. It's actually the fourth book.
Yeah.
And they're all about the same thing. They're all about the topic about which, as you know, I'm so passionate about, we talk about every single week. And that is, you know, how to generate income in retirement and how to know when you're ready to retire and lots of good things surrounding retirement. But this is going to be different because this is kind of like a combination of lots of shows we've done in the past, Sarah,
right,
where we're talking about different things or combining. It's all combined in a book that's really a 2 or 3 hour read.
Right.
It's designed to be that way, and I think the reason that I've written 4 books on this is simple. It's that retirement is a change in mindset in how you invest your money. You know, your entire life, you go to work, you get a paycheck, and you hopefully save by paying yourself first, put some money in a 401k or IRAs, and then you spend the rest with a clear conscience. But retirement is where that whole thing starts to reverse. And now instead of contributing to investments, you're now starting to take distributions from investments. And that becomes scary for a lot of people. Sarah, you remember the story I always talk about. My guy from the late 80s, Ed, great, very successful executive in Hartford, Connecticut, had $6 million. And was only spending $150,000 a year. I say only, but it's small as a percentage of what he had. And he was petrified about running out of money because, again, it's a huge shift from having your paycheck coming in, not having to worry about it, to now having to generate your own income. And that's why today's show is I think going to be so helpful for each and every one of you that are in retirement or within 10 years of retirement.
Right. It's absolutely important to make that psychological shift really between looking at the total return like Dave mentioned and focusing on the way to get income properly from your investments. And part of that income pie is Social Security benefits. So we have our question from a listener. We have Alan in Georgia. Okay. He says, Dave, I talked to the Social Security Administration recently to get some guidance about when I could take my Social Security benefits, but they couldn't help me. So what do you recommend?
Alan, great question. And you're right on that Social Security Administration will not make recommendations. In fact, the employees there are not allowed to make recommendations. And there's lots of things that go into the decision as to when to take Social Security. There are hundreds of different ways to take Social Security. And sometimes the difference between the number 1 best way and the number 2 best way for you specifically can be an extra $100,000 or more over the course of your retirement. And when I say for you specifically, that means how long you're going to continue to work. Are you going to be working while you're collecting for a while? What other source of income you have? Will the Social Security benefits be taxed or not? Also, if you're married, if genetically or maybe health-wise, one of you has a much longer life expectancy than the other. Also, if you're worried about survivorship benefits, if one of you passes on. So again, lots of different variables there, Alan, that you have to take into account. And that's why sometimes the difference between the number 1 best way and the number 2 best way, based upon your specific fact pattern, your life, can be $100,000 or more of additional benefits over the course of your lifetime. So one way to get an answer, Alan, is to work with an income specialist who can A true income specialist should have software that even the Social Security Administration doesn't have, to put in lots of these different variables and to figure out of all the combinations and permutations what the top 3 methods are for you to start collecting your Social Security benefits. That's one way of doing it. And the other way, Sarah, I'm going to defer to you, because I know we've had specific shows in the past right here on the Income Generation about how to maximize Social Security.
All about Social Security, absolutely. And you can listen to those shows by going to retirementincomesourceradioshow.com, where we have all of our past episodes.
Excellent. All right, Alan, hopefully that helps. And but don't shortcut the decision. All I can encourage you to do is make sure you take time and you make the right decision for you. It could be one of the most important investment decisions or financial decisions you make as you're prepping for retirement.
Absolutely. And Alan, thank you so much for sending in your question. I know a lot of people, their ears perk up when they hear, hey, potentially $100,000 more in benefits over the course of my lifetime. People want to know how they can potentially access that, you know. So Alan, thank you so much for sending in your question. If any of our other listeners or our YouTube viewers have a question that you would like to submit, all you have to do is send us an email to askdave@retirementincomesource.com, and you may hear your question answered on a future show. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. And today we have a very special episode because we have a multiple best-selling author on our show. It's actually
very special guest.
Very special guest. It's David Scranton himself. He's come out with a new book, Retirement Income Source, and it's truly the ultimate guide to eternal income in retirement. So today's show is dedicated to really going through the different chapters of this book and talking about these different pieces, because each piece of the income pie is extremely important. So Dave, we've talked a little bit about how it's such a huge psychological shift to go from earning a paycheck and hopefully saving and spending your money to relying on your income from your investments in retirement. You even mentioned your friend who had plenty of money, even back then, years ago, multiple $6 million, and he was still petrified.
In municipal bonds, where you can get 6% tax-free,
very safe
right?
Investments,
so that's $360,000 of tax-free income. He's spending $150,000. Anybody listening would say, well, gosh, you just reinvest the other $210,000, you're going to grow your money, right? But because it was such an emotional time, retirement for him, the first time ever he had to take money out of investments instead of put it in, he was petrified. He was worried. This is a smart executive, right, that dealt with financial matters on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And, you know, this wasn't always as big of an issue. You know, in the past, we talk about pensions a lot of times. You know, 50 years ago, most people retired and they had the old-fashioned type pension plan.
Yeah, that was great back then. A lot of people benefited from that.
You didn't put a dime into it. Your
right.
company put all the money into it, and you got income for the rest of your life, and that was great. But now most companies have done away with that, and even some municipalities and states are talking about significantly limiting the benefits or doing away with the benefits. So that puts the burden squarely on the shoulders of you, our listeners, right, to do the right thing. But also Social Security. You know, Alan talked about Social Security, had some great questions. And,
Back in the day, Social Security benefits used to be a lot higher. They used to go a lot further. It seems like they're shrinking almost every year.
As a proportionate part of people's needs in retirement, Social Security was more.
Yeah.
And it's becoming less and less. And a big part of that is because, you know, the measure they use to determine inflation doesn't keep up with normal inflation rates. So, Social Security is losing pace. So what do you have to worry about when planning for income in retirement? Well, you have to worry about having enough income today, but you also have to worry with longer life expectancies, have enough of an inflation hedge for the future, you know, having enough to keep up with healthcare expenses, and maybe even leave a legacy if that's one of your goals. So the question becomes, what is your purpose for your money? And a question that we're going to explore coming up in just a moment. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and today it's actually about Dave's brand new book, Retirement Income Source, the ultimate guide to eternal income. So the book shares the same name as our radio show because both Dave and I were very passionate about talking about income, specifically income investing. And Dave, a few minutes ago, we talked about why it's difficult for a lot of people to wrap their minds around this concept of actually generating income the right way from their investments, as opposed to when they were working. You know, they're receiving a paycheck, they're spending and saving it. It can be a real psychological shift.
It is a psychological shift because you're never relied on your money to generate income before. And, you know, you think about like a football game, right? When you're down near your end zone, right? All you want to do is pick up yards. You don't care how you get them. You just want to get yards. You want to get, you know, to the other, you know, the past the 50-yard line, right?
Moving the ball down the field.
That's right. You at least want to start getting near the red zone. But once you get in the red zone, the strategy changes, you know, and you have to think about how we want to get in the red zone, or do we want to just leave the ball in the middle of the field to give our field kicker a good chance of you know, getting it through the uprights. And these are decisions that change as you get closer to that end zone. As people get closer to retirement, the same is true. So think about it, Sarah, right? Can you think we have one single listener that doesn't want to get maximum return with minimum risk on their investments?
I don't think there's anybody out there that says, nope, I'm good. I don't want any more money. Yeah. I'm done.
Everyone's maximum return with minimum risk, but you have to say maximum return for what purpose, right? And, you know, when you're on near your part of the end zone, you know, you can do lots of things, plays that you can't do when you're in the red zone, right? You can air out the ball. You got options down the field. You don't have that as you get closer to the end zone, in the red zone. And the same is true here. So, you know, people want maximum return with minimum risk, and all they care about is total return. Like we always talk about in the show, Sarah, they don't care whether it comes from the I, the income, or from the G, the growth. They just want to get return. And remember, total return equals income plus growth. Again, one more time, total return equals income plus growth. Income is interest and dividends. Growth is capital appreciation. So again, when you're back pinned against your own end zone, all you care about is, hey, I want to get total return. I don't care if it's income growth, it doesn't matter. Move the ball forward.
I don't care how we do it. We're just moving forward.
That's right. So maximum return with minimum risk. But then as you get close to the end zone, you want to say, well, for what purpose? Is it to set up the field goal? Is it to run it in? Is it to do a short pass and bring it in? And then you have to start thinking about that. So in this world, all of a sudden the purpose changes, right? And when I asked the question in previous shows, you know, I know a lot of you, when I say, what's the purpose for most of your money in retirement? Is it to leave a huge legacy? You don't even want to touch any of it. You just want to leave a big legacy. Well, for most people, they tell me on a routine basis, no, that's not the primary purpose. Or is it just to increase the value of it so you can make a lump sum purchase in retirement? Well, again, most of you have told me repeatedly, no, that's not the major purchase. What is the major purchase? To maximize income. To maximize income so you can replace your paycheck in retirement. If that's your primary purpose with a majority of your money, then you've got to say, well, I want maximum return with minimum risk. But for what purpose? Maximum return in the form of income.
Absolutely. Focusing on income and making that shift from that total return to that income mindset. Let's get to our next Ask Dave question. We have a question from Jeremy in Arkansas. He says, I do have one of those old-fashioned pension plans as well as decent... Yeah, Jeremy's lucky, right?
Yeah.
As well as Social Security benefits. So I feel okay about my income, but my family lives pretty long, most people into their late 90s. So overall, I'm worried about inflation.
All right, Jeremy. Well, late 90s. You're right. You have to be worried about inflation when it comes to your investments, or you better take up smoking and drinking. Those are the two alternatives. But you're right. So I assume that your traditional pension plan probably does not have an inflation hedge. Some do, but it's rare. So the few that are still around, most of them do not have an inflation hedge. So you're right. You feel good early on, but the longer you live in retirement, the more painful it becomes. Also, as you know, the same is true with Social Security. Social Security gives a cost of living raise, but as we mentioned before, it doesn't really keep up with inflation. So Social Security, you know, keeps up maybe with half of inflation, right? So that's why they call inflation the silent killer. It's like high blood pressure in the medical field, because it's just gradually tightens the financial noose, if you will, until things get harder and harder. So you're smart to be concerned about inflation, but you've got a gift. You know, we'll talk through the rest of the show about inflation, so please make sure you stay with us, Jeremy. But you're fortunate because at least you don't need a lot of income today, it sounds like. You're getting that from Social Security and a pension, or at least through your early years in retirement, I should say. But later on, it's going to be a different story. So you get to reinvest a lot of that income to create your own inflation hedge for the future. And that's powerful. A lot of our other listeners aren't as fortunate as you because they need the income today, but they also need an inflation hedge on that income. So, take advantage of that. And the best way you can have an inflation hedge is to spend some of the income, but not all of it. Reinvest some of it for the future. So, Jeremy, I hope that helps. I hope you stay tuned the rest of our show today, as we're going to talk more about keeping up with inflation and through maximization of income.
Yep. And going back to our football analogies, Jeremy, his team he scored enough points to really win the game, but he just has to be defensive now and protected against inflation.
That's
overall.
right. Yeah.
So, Jeremy, again, thank you for sending in your question. If any of our listeners have a question that you would like to send in, maybe hear it answered on a future show, all you have to do is email us at askdave@retirementincomesource.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and today we are talking about his latest book, also called The Retirement Income Source. And we're going through the most important chapters inside that book to cover what really our listeners need to know when it comes to investing for income. So we've talked about the shift from total return to actually generating income from your investments. We've also talked a little bit about Social Security benefits and how some people might not know that the Social Security Administration legally can't help you with that. You're going to need to work with a specialist for those. We also talked about healthcare and inflation in general. Jeremy had a great question where he was wondering about inflation in the long term, 30 years down the road. So, Dave, what are some hedges that our listeners could use? You mentioned one, but what are some other ways potentially that they could hedge against inflation?
Well, the first thing is for people to realize that, what we talked about right before the question is that you want maximum return with minimum risk for what purpose? And there was never an issue. People's lives, they just, you want to put the ball near, you want to get yards, your whole playbook's in front of you because you're pinned at your own 10-yard line, right? But that changes. As you get closer to the goal, you've got to identify for what purpose. And if you're like most of our listeners where that purpose is income, then you've got to think of, okay, income, not just first year of retirement, but income years 10, 20, and 30. So think of it as this way. Think of it as purpose versus performance, right? Early on, you're just looking for performance. You want total return. You don't care whether it comes from the I or the G. Same thing is true in football, right? You want to get those yards to get yourself down the field, away from your own end zone. You don't care if it comes from the running game, the passing game, or through penalties. You want to pick up yards, right? But all of a sudden, when you get into that red zone, it matters. And it matters because, it's purpose versus performance. Not just performance, it's what is the purpose of this money. Right. And it's income. And like you said, Sarah, it's not just income now, it's income long term.
And most people, once they get closer to retirement, the goal, or they realize, I think after speaking with, especially with income specialists, they realize their goal isn't max performance.
Right.
A lot of people are thinking,
but they still want the inflation hedge you talked about.
They do want the inflation hedge, right? But they're not. They realize their concern shouldn't be that max performance. It's almost like, let's say you're taking a cross country trip. A sports car, technically it might get you there fast enough, but maybe an RV is going to be the better situation over the long term, right? What's the purpose of your trip? If you're going across the country, I drive a sports car. I would not want to trek across the country in a sports car.
No, exactly. And it's and I think you're right. People have a tough time emotionally, and we'll talk hopefully later in the show about emotionally why they have that tough time with it because they've been total return focused. Just trying to put yards on forever. Yeah. But to answer your inflation question, there's a few ways that you can do it. One way, as I spoke to Jeremy, yes, thank you. Jeremy, we talked about just not spending all your income. Yeah. Another way to do it, which we'll talk about hopefully later on the show, is through higher dividend equities that maybe the dividends can go up in time, right? Because you have to worry about inflation. Yeah. You have to worry about healthcare inflation, right? And healthcare inflation goes up at almost double the rate of regular inflation.
Oh yeah, it increases much quicker than regular inflation even.
Yeah. So in growth in the stock market typically doesn't do so well in high inflationary periods. So as a result, just being in growth doesn't really solve the inflation problem. Frankly, income could do a better job. So income becomes a solution for people who want income today, who want income in the future, who want a bit of a hedge against healthcare, and frankly, people who don't want to spend their principal and want to leave a legacy for their loved ones.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about the right way to invest for income. But first, Dave, we've got to talk about the wrong ways to invest for income, aka engineering income. And some of our listeners, you might have this going on right now in your portfolio. So you're going to want to listen and make sure that you are investing for income the right way. We'll talk about that. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with multiple best-selling author David Scranton as we talk about his latest book, which is a bestseller on Amazon. It's Retirement Income Source, The Ultimate Guide to Eternal Income, and you can actually purchase this book on our website, retirementincomesourcebook.com. Dave, you have so many different important chapters in this book, and we're talking about a selection of them today, including why people have the difficulty in making that switch from total return focus to income focused, as well as inflation, how that can really be a true killer in retirement, and really why people need to have that income first investment strategy, especially as they near retirement.
Yeah, people have such a tough time making the transition that, frankly, Sarah, many don't.
Yeah.
And they stick with a growth. They stick with either a growth first, income second strategy versus an income first, growth second strategy, or maybe even worse, a growth only strategy, right? And then when it comes time to get retirement income, they have no choice but to do really what I say is one of the most cancerous investment strategies that anybody can embark upon, and that is using the withdrawal method. It's trying to engineer income from withdrawals.
Right. And this is the wrong way to generate income, essentially. Yeah. Can you explain it a little bit, Dave, for our listeners, what that means exactly to engineer the income?
It's often when people stay in mutual funds or exchange-traded funds, so maybe they keep their money in 401ks when they retire, because the mutual funds generally don't generate a lot of a lot of income. They're there for more growth or capital appreciation. They leave their money there, and they take systematic withdrawals every year. But it's important to understand that a withdrawal is not income. Yes, it may be taxed as income by the IRS because it's a withdrawal from your IRA or 401k, but it's not income in the investment sense of the word. The only true income in the investment sense is interest and dividends. So, Sarah, when people do this and they start to take income, by definition, they're taking principal. They're selling shares. Now, they're crossing their fingers and toes and hoping that it grows, but they're still selling shares. They have fewer shares next year than they did this year, right? You have
to rely on that growth. It's a growth first approach, basically.
So now you have to say, okay, we talked about inflation with our last caller, right? So what do we do with Jeremy, right? He wants an inflation hedge, maybe even a healthcare inflation hedge. But by the time he gets to the point where inflation's a burden, or certainly where healthcare expenses might be a burden, hopefully well into his 80s, God willing, he's got far fewer shares because he's been cannibalizing his fund.
Right. And that's when you really need that money potentially as you're dealing with the rising healthcare costs and potentially failing health.
That's right. And and what it does, it simply means you have less and less money, and you've got to have a lot of growth. You're rolling the dice hoping that momentum keeps growing and the price per share keeps going up. And there's no guarantee that's going to happen.
Right. It also depends when you retire, as we'll see, because there's certain time periods in history where we would have been underwater for 13 years. And if you were retired during that point, it would have not been very good for your portfolio if you were invested using the withdrawal strategy during that time period. But for now, let's get into our next Ask Dave question. We have a great question from Greg in Michigan. He must be listening. He said, Dave, I'm not retired yet, and you say this growth first approach is really not that great, but I think the market is doing well, and I really want to take advantage of it.
All right, Greg. Well, you have what we call, when we talk about your children and grandchildren, you have FOMO. That's fear of missing out. FOMO, my friend. And Greg, if you're not retired, you might have valid reasons for it. You may say, well, I need to get more growth. I just can't afford to retire today. And maybe you're willing to roll the dice. And I guess that's a decision that you have to make. But I'm going to assume that you have enough to retire, that you've saved enough, that you have enough points to win the game of life, as Sarah said a moment ago, making an analogy there. That if that's the case, then, what's problematic with you trying to squeeze out a few more points, you trying to run up the score? Well, you know from sports, Greg, that sometimes you try to run up the score and you get a turnover. You get unexpected penalties, you get turnovers, and next thing you know, they're running up the score against you. And that can happen. In fact, that happened to people many times. You know, imagine, for example, that we were sitting here in the late 1990s. Now, I'm going to pick an extremely bad period just to illustrate an example here, Greg. But let's say you did this in the late 1990s. We're having this conversation. You're trying to squeeze a little bit more out of the markets. But then 2000 comes and boom, the bubble bursts in the stock market. And the stock market was underwater for 13 years. It took until the end of 2012 for the market to get back to where it was at the beginning of the year 2000. So now for 13 years, you've got to sit there, you're underwater, and you've got to decide, do I want to retire with less money, or do I want to work 13 more years? Do I want to go back to, do I want to get a part-time job? What do I want to do? And so that's what you're gambling with here. You know, if you have enough points to win the game of life, now there's really no upside if you win, except that you're performance-minded. Remember, Greg, a moment ago, I talked about purpose versus performance, right? And I encourage people not just to be performance-based. That worked for you all this time up until your retirement, where you thought about, I just want to get return, I want to maximize my total return, irrespective of where it comes from, the I or the G, the income or the growth. But now I encourage you to make the paradigm shift to be purpose-based. And if the purpose of this money is retirement income in the next 10 years, well then, that is exactly why I think the FOMO could hurt you. So hopefully you can do whatever it takes to cure the FOMO, Greg.
Absolutely. And Greg, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if any of our listeners or YouTube viewers have a question that you would like Dave to answer, potentially even on a future show, all you have to do is send us an email to askdave@retirementincomesource.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and we have been going over his latest book, The Retirement Income Source, The Ultimate Guide to Eternal Income. And there's so much important information in this book, but we've tried to break it down into some of the most important topics that our listeners really need to understand, like making that shift from total return focus to income focus, as well as making sure that you are not investing for income the wrong way with the withdrawal strategy. And Dave, you mentioned a great point, which I really think crystallizes it for a lot of our listeners, which is that time period between 2000 to 2012. And we have a chart that I know our advisors actually show people that explains, and if it looks like a W, you know, if you see those huge dips, it goes back up, and then another huge dip, really crystallizes for people why that withdrawal strategy would have been so dangerous during that time period. You would have ended up losing half your money at the end of it.
Well, even if you're not doing the withdrawal strategy, even if you're just, you know, like Greg, where you're not retired yet, if you want to retire in 5 years, well, guess what? Now it might get pushed out to 13 years.
Right.
And I think if I asked Greg, you know, hey, are you willing to work an extra 8? He'd probably say no. So you've always got to do it. You got to say, great, well, if I'm riding the momentum upward for now, but what happens if it turns? What's the ramification?
Right.
But like you said, it's even worse if you're taking the withdrawals, because not only are you selling shares, so you have fewer shares down the road to generate an inflation hedge or to pay for health care, but moreover, you're reverse dollar cost averaging, right?
Yep. Which is basically the goal, right? Is to buy low and sell high. But when it comes to reverse dollar cost averaging, you're basically buying high and selling low.
And that's why, Sarah, for somebody your age, dollar cost averaging is your best friend. You're putting money in that 401k every single month. Yep. You know, you don't look at your statements every month. You don't care. In the months the market's down, you're buying more shares. Right. In the months the market's up, you're buying fewer shares. So you're dollar cost averaging, right? You're getting your average costs down. But the problem is you as a loyal listener are probably, I would guess, you know, older than my significantly younger co-host here, Sarah Samuels, right?
Thanks, Dave.
And as a result, having, you know, a few more years, you're more worried about, I would think, reverse dollar cost averaging than you are dollar cost averaging. You're concerned about, what if I retire and I need to take these withdrawals systematically? Now, the math is exactly the same as with Sarah, but the outcome is reversed, because now you're selling more shares when the market's down to get the monthly amount that you need. Why? Because you're not generating actual income, you're engineering income through the sale of shares. So now you're selling more income when the market's down, fewer shares when the market's up, and as a result, you're cannibalizing principal. And so there's so many reasons, Sarah, why you know, the withdrawal method is just it is the most cancerous financial strategy that a retiree can embark upon.
And one of the worst things, Dave, is that most of your average financial advisor out there, someone that's not a specialist, most of the big firms out there, they are utilizing these strategies. They're looking at using more of these cookie cutter type portfolios for people, as opposed to the portfolios that actually generate income the right way with an income first approach.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the difference between working with a financial advisor, a generic advisor, versus working with an actual income specialist who specializes in generating income the right way. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
And welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and today we're visiting with best-selling author, yours truly.
He's also the co-host of the show, the host of the show.
That's right, with the book, The Retirement Income Source, that just came out actually earlier in October, I believe. And so far we've covered why emotionally it's such a difficult paradigm shift for people to make, investors to make, from being total return focused during your accumulation years, irrespective of whether it comes from growth or income, to having an income first, growth second approach. We also discussed why the problem is so much greater today with traditional pension plans having gone the way of the cuckoo bird, with Social Security now representing, as you pointed out, Sarah, a smaller and smaller percentage of covering people's retirement income needs. And also why the withdrawal method, why trying to stay with a growth first strategy and engineering income through systematic withdrawals is perhaps the most cancerous financial strategy that a retiree can utilize.
Yep. And Dave, you mentioned that we have some listeners out there, some listeners that they want this growth focus. They have a fear of FOMO, but there's a lot of different emotions when it comes to money, when it comes to investing, even coupled with the emotions surrounding retirement in general.
Well, first of all, you have optimism, right? And as Americans, we tend to be a pretty optimistic lot. And I think we have lots of reasons to be optimistic, right? We live in what I see, and I think you see, as being the best country in the world, right? So it's great to be optimistic. But you don't want to let optimism cloud your judgment and realism. And sometimes that's what happens. If people don't have the right rear view mirror, Sarah, they look at, in the truck, I know you have a fancy little sports car, but I mean, in a truck where you see the mirror and then you have the little convex mirror that says, objects may be closer than they appear.
Yep.
Well, that's exactly, I think, the wrong mirror to look at when it comes to investment planning. And that's, I think, the mirror that most people use.
Right. Most people want to look in the rear view as opposed to looking forward.
Well, right. And so first of all, you should be looking forward as to what's going on in the markets and the economy and what you see moving forward. But moreover, I think people have short-term memories. And unfortunately, that means that, when you have a period that really, truly, that period I talked about was only a little bit more than a decade ago, where we were underwater for 13 years, and people have forgotten about it. They seem to think it can't happen anymore. And really, 10 years ago, that's a lot closer than it appears in that convex mirror. And, the fact that it happened once, Sarah, tells us it can what?
It can happen again. Most likely it can happen again.
It can happen again. So when you're looking at history, you have to take a long view as well as a short view, but then you have to project ahead and say, well, okay, what do I see moving forward? And is this reasonably, can this happen again? And again, what are the ramifications if it does happen? What does it mean for me? Does it mean my 5-year retirement goal goes out the window and I'm working for 13, right? Because that may stop people right there, dead in their tracks, from having FOMO.
Yeah, that'll stop it right there. Dave, a lot of our listeners might be feeling a lot of these emotions and feeling overwhelmed by it, which is why it's important to work with the right income specialist. And our next Ask Dave question actually has to do with this, I think. So we have a question here from Brad in Texas. He says, what you're saying really does make a lot of sense, but I've talked to several financial advisors and no one sounds like you, Dave. So why not?
Yeah, Brad, that's a shocker.
Maybe they're not best-selling authors like Dave. That's probably why they don't sound the same.
Well, they don't have anything to write about because they're all saying the same thing for the most part. And so why don't they sound like me, Brad? Why don't they talk income first, growth second? And there's lots of reasons why. I'll put them in a few categories. Number one, most of the research is biased toward what makes more money for the firm, and that's part of it. Number two, I think being an income specialist really takes more work. It takes greater bandwidth. So it takes greater bandwidth, whether you're talking greater bandwidth of people, more manpower, perhaps a higher level of knowledge when it comes to investment markets, when it comes to technology expense. So it takes more research time, more research knowledge, more technology expense, and most advisors just don't have the bandwidth to do that. But I think the biggest thing is that people, and again, they get their research from their firms or from firms that they're maybe that they're loosely affiliated with, and those research are skewed toward the profit motives of whatever it is those firms sell or specialize in. And as a result, these advisors unwittingly aren't getting unbiased research. And Brad, so much so that I think you've just motivated me to do something. Sarah, I want to make our next show all about this. Next week I want to focus all about talking about why different advisors have different business models and maybe why most don't sound like we sound right here on the Retirement Income Source. So Brad, make sure you're here next week. Put it down in your calendar, and I think we'll be able to give you a lot of information moving toward answering your question.
Yeah, and Brad, thank you for giving us our inspiration for next week's show, and I hope you tune in, and thanks for sending in your question for Dave to answer. If any of our listeners have a question, maybe about your retirement strategy, maybe about something you heard recently and you want to ask Dave, all you have to do is send us an email to askdave@retirementincomesource.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with David Scranton, our best-selling author. He's released the most recent book, actually, the 4th book, Retirement Income Source, The Ultimate Guide to Eternal Income. And our listeners can get this book on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or by going to the website for the book, retirementincomesourcebook.com. And Dave, you just answered a really important question from Brad, who said, you know, I've been talking to advisors, I've been listening to what they say, and nobody really sounds like you. And that's because income specialists are completely different than just regular financial advisors, almost like a doctor, a general practitioner versus a doctor, maybe a cardiologist, someone that specializes in a certain organ.
That's right. And there are a couple reasons why that we'll expound on next week. So I'm glad Brad gave us the inspiration for the next show. I think that's awesome. But so there are a few things here. First of all, when you're investing with an income first, growth second approach, one thing is you might get involved in things that are bonds and bond-like instrument based, that are more contractual. And those are things that, frankly, as you know, Sarah, most financial advisors just don't have any experience with. Most of them are really brokers. And as you know, there's a reason stockbrokers are called stockbrokers. They typically favor stocks. So that's why even when they put you in bonds, for example, they typically don't buy bonds. They buy bond mutual funds.
Bond funds, absolutely.
Or maybe bond exchange traded funds, which are essentially a stock of a company that owns bonds.
Right. Not the same thing at all, but they sound similar. So sometimes people get confused.
They sound similar, but they're riskier because there's two important guarantees that appeal to retirees when it comes to bonds. And both those guarantees are off the table when it comes to bond funds. So right then and there, you typically have, if you're an income first, growth second advisor, you've got to learn about a whole half of the investment world that you really don't have much experience with. Right. But then how about the stock half? Well, that's a challenge too, because traditionally working with a lot of younger folks, it's growth first, income second. Or as I said earlier in the show, maybe growth first, they don't worry about income at all, right?
Yeah, income's not even on their mind.
Yeah, it was last week we talked about how, call the police, right? How the growth investors stole the word return, and they started using return and growth synonymously, and they're not, right? So they've totally ignored the income component. And if you, and there's some other things about being a growth-based advisor that we're going to talk about next week that are problematic, Sarah, that are some things that most of growth-based advisors out there may not be aware of. So I even encourage you, if you're an advisor and you're a growth-based financial advisor, I encourage you to listen to next week's show, because you'll probably learn a lot of things that your firm or your source of research hasn't particularly mentioned to you in the past. And
well, Dave, you just mentioned too that with growth-based advisors, they're really limited in the tools that they can use, and that's different than an income specialist. Income specialists have a wide variety of tools, and they're able to invest in the things that people are invested in now in the growth way, but they could do it for income.
Sarah, some growth-based advisors are limited by their firms, but a lot are limited by themselves, right?
Their knowledge.
They don't have the knowledge, they don't have the bandwidth. Again, they don't have the knowledge for bonds and bond-like instruments or the bandwidth economically or time-wise, so they don't do it. Or even within the stock market. Right. There's a different mindset with a growth first, income second approach from an income first, growth second approach. It's totally different.
Right.
It's like having an offensive coordinator that has a strong passing game and runs the ball every once in a while to keep the defense, on their toes, versus the one that executes primarily a running game and puts the ball up in the air every once in a while to keep the defense on their toes. Same
totally
thing.
Different strategies, right? And I think people too, a lot of people have misconceptions too about investing in the stock market. They're not really, they don't know all the different ways that you can actually invest to get income,
right,
which we're going to talk about next week. So we hope you tune in and make sure that you get your copy of Dave's latest bestseller, Retirement Income Source, The Ultimate Guide to Eternal Income. You can get your copy by going to retirementincomesourcebook.com.
And most important, make sure that you're here with us next week for part 2 of this week's show. Same time, same station. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.